Kia ora tātou. E te mana whenua, tēnā koutou, ko Catherine Febria aho. So I'm a researcher as part of a team that we call ourselves, or work under the title CAREX, the Canterbury Waterway Rehabilitation Experiment. And so I'm here today representing several members of our team here that are here as well. And my role is to just give you a bit of framing, tell you a little bit about what we learned over the last 5 years. So you can keep in touch with some of the information that we're sharing through these different links, and we'll refer to them throughout the course of today. So I just want to acknowledge a few speakers. So Dr. Angus McIntosh and Jon Harding will be co-presenting with me, and we have other members from our team, Dr. Christy Hogsden and Haley at the back. So we're all here to just meet with you all and share with you some of the things that we've learned. We wanted to first start off by acknowledging a decade of research funding by the Mackenzie Trust. So these are two brothers from Ashburton, and this presentation pretty much ends a decade of research that we've done specifically on agricultural stream restoration. And the idea being that the research that was generated on agricultural solutions was for the greatest possible benefit for the people of Canterbury. This is also research that have come out of a huge team effort. So these are many faces of people that have done the work that we'll be talking about. And a lot of the research that we'll really just talk around, but there is a lot of work going into these different issues and solutions that we've been trialing specifically over the last 5 years. So today's pretty focused on highlights and specifically things that we've learned and reflected on around these particular issues. An approach that we call the CAREX approach. Tools around nitrates, fine sediments in waterways, as well as the aquatic weeds, which are a drainage problem in these waterways. And this is capstoned by a strong partnership that we started 5 years ago around outreach and co-development of solutions and trialing them completely on farm waterways across the region. So some of you might have been here when we first came to you when we started CAREX in 2014, and we did an ECAN seminar then, and we were really trying to figure out an ideal way of testing solutions. And a lot of that started with conversations on farms across Canterbury and reflecting on things that we could trial, and also thinking about this larger landscape of decision making and where science was needed. And we ended up starting the experiment involving 23 landowners and their families. And we identified 9 waterways that were 1 kilometer long, all in the headwaters or where the spring source met. Waterways that are about 1 to 2 meters wide, so really small waterways. And we identified 14 or so different types of tools for these various issues. And at the time of that the experiment was started, that involved the different councils and more than 40 individuals, and that number has since grown and multiplied. And this is all under this one umbrella that we call CAREX. Within the School of Biological Sciences and the CAREX team, there are 15 researchers, and this is a mix of technicians, summer students, PhD students, and researchers that we were all coordinating all sorts of activities to do this work. So I guess when we came and spoke with you a few years ago, we tried to emphasize some earlier work from the earlier 5 years of research, and it was around having data to understand the different interacting stressors around sediments and nutrients and what scale at which are they operating, riparian management, what does that look like across the region, and we identified this or coined a CAREX approach that was around starting at the top and fixing leaking plumbing. And this is really data and papers that we presented then around targeting small streams for management. This had to do with the fact that these smaller streams are in poor condition, but they can potentially offer really great habitat and are connected to downstream waterways. It's at this scale that farmers and decision makers are actively making decisions, and so it seemed scalable at that time. And we'd had data to show that the larger streams were in better condition, and so we needed to really target these smaller areas, these smaller waterways, as a potential place for solutions. We also talked about fixing leaky plumbing, and so this is one example of what we mean. And so even with the best riparian management in place, we, through different walks across these waterways, there were these areas of, people call these critical source areas, or rills, or open drains, and that sort of thing that circumvent riparian networks, these riparian protection systems. And so they could be hot spots of stressors within a waterway. And so with that in mind, hopefully we're going to start by talking about each of the different issues. We call these a toolbox approach. And so for each of the different topics, we have little tip sheets that we'll refer to and are now publicly available, really thinking about Environment Canterbury as one of these key users of these resources. And so that's how we've structured the talk. And so I'll come back at the end to just kind of remind you of that information, where it's sitting, and hopefully it's of use, and we can have a discussion from there. Okay, so we will switch to Angus, and we'll talk about, we thought we'd start with nitrates.
Thank you. Is that working okay? Great. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Angus McIntosh host. Great to be here. Lots of friendly faces in the audience, and it's good to be able to show you some of the results here. A lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about just shortly is by Brandon Gola, who's a PhD student. Well, he's actually not a PhD student anymore. He's satisfied all the requirements of his PhD. He's about to graduate, and so this is his hard work over the last 3.5 to 4 years. And what we started looking at along at 9 CAREX sites was thinking about all of the inputs to 1 kilometre reaches. So the idea is we were starting at the top and we were assessing what was going on over these 9 kilometre reaches. And we did that over 4 years, the 2013 to 14 season through to 2016-17 season. This is a huge amount of work by Haley and lots of other helpers who went out and sampled a whole lot of different inputs to these. And so we're talking about open drains, which might be these big arrows, tile drains, which are these little dotted ones which flow intermittently, and we've been measuring those seasonally and measuring fluxes. And I'm presenting a lot of boiled down data here, but hopefully you get the idea. So we've got open drains that look something like this. We've got tile drains which can look like these sorts of things here, and trying to understand where the critical source areas are, which bits of the waterway we can best work with to be able to get our tills in the right place to do the best job of managing a nitrate problem. So to cut to the chase here, these are all of the data. This is the downstream nitrate flux, so the amount of nitrate coming out in terms of kilograms per day. Some of these are pretty huge, considering they're just pretty small waterways. And this is the upstream flux, and you can see that upstream is really highly correlated with downstream. And what's happening there is there's lots of nitrate coming in through groundwater, seeps and those sorts of things at the top of our catchments, and that is driving a lot of the nitrate load in these. These are in places like Hinds and those sorts of waterways. If we have a look at those in the tile drains and open drains, though, this is the flux here. Some of those are associated, are driving some of that downstream flux, but some of them are pretty independent, some of them are quite small, and they're much more variable. So if we kind of think about the contribution of these various sources to the fluxes in these streams, or trying to understand what explains variance in what's coming out at the bottom of a catchment, then we can explain 46% of it through those upstream, mostly groundwater inputs. So that means we need to be working at catchment scales. Yeah, we're not going to solve that by anything that we're necessarily doing in this 1 kilometre reach there, because it's coming out of the groundwater. It's happening somewhere else in the catchment. The open and tile drains are contributing about 15%, so that's the bit that we could potentially work on locally along our 1 kilometre reaches. And there's actually a large chunk, 39%, of variability which we can't explain yet through measuring all of those things over those. And so that's a bit still to be worked on. We've started to work on multiple types of tools to be able to deal with this sort of problem. And the first one we did, which was done quite a while ago now, about 5 years ago, or finished up about 5 years ago, was an ecosystem scale experiment in a bunch of waterways near Rangiora, a bunch of drains, Heskett and those sorts of things, drains near Rangiora there. And we were looking to simulate riparian leaf inputs by putting lots of dried leaf matter in the stream. So we're adding carbon, and the idea was that that would supply food for microbes which would increase denitrification. So take up nitrate in the water and convert that to nitrogen gas. And so we would lose nitrogen through denitrification. That's really important because, for example, in the CAM system here, here's the nitrate flux, and we can see that there's a lot of variability in the amount of nitrogen coming in at different points in the system. And actually, you can have a look. If you have a look at this branch here, it's going down from here to there. So somehow we're losing it, and if we can, a likely process involved in there is denitrification. So if we can enhance that and add to that, then that would be really fantastic. This is a model of the overall results, just got published, late last year, and this is the relationship between, if we were able to establish this amount of canopy cover in the whole entire CAM catchment, then this is the amount of nitrogen, extra nitrogen, which we would remove through that denitrification process. So it's basically taking those stream level results and scaling them up. There's a lot of variability here. The best we could do under the the best case scenario would be around this 45% here, but and more conservative estimates are in this dark grey band here. And so if we can get a large amount of riparian cover in the catchment, which might produce the leaf fall, which would work out to be about the amounts of leaf litter which we put in the water, then you would get about this much of the nitrogen load taken out. So we might be able to get up to 20, early 20s in terms of percentage of nitrate that we could take out, for example. We've also been working more practically, and this is another experiment of Brandon's, on trying to really boost that amount. And a way of doing that might be to put in a really full-on carbon source like wood chips. And so this is an experiment where Brandon added really concentrated amounts of wood chips under one of our Hines streams here. So this is over a 800 metre reach. This is what this looks like, so adding in lots and lots of wood, this is still proof of concept kind of thing. This is what some of the concentrations look like, and so we've been actually able to measure actual reductions in nitrate concentration downstream of these wood chip patches. And some of these are pretty spectacular actually. I think this is an example of some of this data. So this is a control reach upstream, and there's variability in there as we've got groundwater coming in and out, because there's lots of groundwater influences going in here, so there's upwelling and downwelling zones. But very often we saw these really quite substantial drops in nitrate concentration downstream of our water addition reach. These are pretty amazing, if we're thinking about that we've got somewhere around about 12 to 13, 14 milligrams per litre, and then it suddenly goes down to 7 or 8. Something pretty spectacular is happening. So that's really positive. The challenging part is that those drops are sporadic, intermittent, and it's hard to tell exactly where they're going, and they're only short-lived. So this is what all of those data look like, and you can see that the control reach is bouncing around a bit as well, and you can see that sometimes the drop's just immediately downstream of the woods, sometimes it's way down here. These data are quite challenging to analyse, but it suggests that we're really on the right track here. There's some possibilities, but there's still a lot to go in terms of perfecting this and being able to manage this at a large scale. That's going to revolve around trying to stack multiple tools, and that's what we've mainly been trying to do in CAREX. So we're thinking about converting nitrate to nitrogen gas by doing denitrification. In order to make that work, we need a carbon source, we need microbes, and we need the water to be resident there. Those are the key ingredients. And lots of the tools, all of the tools are pretty much combining most of those things. And they're things like riparian buffers. This is a bioreactor up here. There's some more detail about that coming in a second. Possibly two-stage channels. This is one in a really raw form, but it looks much better now that it's all grassed up. And those in-stream woodpack kinds of ideas. Combining all of those together might give us the best case scenario that we can. We have done that in a couple of paired catchments. One a control catchment up the top here with a number of tile drains and open drains and things coming in, a pretty standard riparian margin, and then another here which we gave the full caboodle CAREX treatment to, if you like. So lots of So this was pre-rehabilitation data from spring 2014 to 15, and post-rehabilitation 2015 to 2017. This is what this looks like after we've done things. In fact, these CAREXs are now holding hands. We've got complete canopy cover over that reach. John will tell you a bit more about that. Some of the tools that we're using are it's kind of annoying that's in there, but there's a whole bunch. If you search CAREX toolbox handouts, there's lots of details about particular things that we did here, which are online, and a Figshare site which you will be able to get on in more detail. So at Yeatman's we put in, and in the site we put in bioreactors. There were 3 bioreactors which were going in that site. We did full riparian management. We did lots of bank rebattering, refencing, those sorts of things. We tried to deal with all the leaky plumbing. These are the data that Brandon has at the moment, and bear with me here, okay? This is not that difficult to get your mind around once you see what I'm on about here, okay? This is the change in the slope of the reach discharge. So this reach, depending on whether the farm is pumping and what's going on with the hydrology at that point in time in this reach, it's either gaining or losing water down the reach, okay? You can think about whether we've got a wet summer or a dry summer, that sort of thing. This is the amount of that we're trying to take out, where we're comparing our upstream control reach with, or sort of our before data versus end data, if you like. And you can see that, so going from this would be little, this would be not very much. And so what we're comparing here is pre versus post in a control stream where we didn't do anything, and there's really no effect. There's no difference between the green points here and the open triangles here. What happens is that as the amount of water that's going down the stream, the amount that's flushing through, amount of groundwater that's going through, our ability to be able to remove nitrate, or the reach to remove nitrate or process it, reduces, right? That makes sense. Lots of water, lots of nitrate coming through, the efficiency of all of those tools declines quite a lot and doesn't work. This is what happened in our treatment stream, so there is a treatment effect, but we're only seeing an effect size here where we're decreasing the amount of nitrate at relatively low flows. Yeah, when the reach is more or less stable, or is kind of a losing reach, and it's a pretty small amount. We've done some back of the envelope calculations here, and it's important, but it's not amazing yet. So we're still working through some of that data, but that's pretty much where we're at in terms of stacking tools. So it suggests that we can do some things, but we're not getting that 20 or 30% coming out that we'd really like to do. We're still a long way from doing that, and we're only managing to take 5 or 10% off the top of the flux when the flows are relatively low, if you see what I mean. Otherwise it's going straight through, and everything we're doing in that 1 kilometre reach is not having too much of an effect on the overall what's coming out of the end of the pipe. Does that make sense? All right, so the main takeaways here is to understand the scale and source of the nitrate. That's absolutely varying spatially and temporally. There's lots to be learned about how we can enhance those nitrogen uptake tools with carbon additions. There's lots of promise there. We need to keep working on that. And we think that the limiting factors can be overcome and tested. That's going to involve lots more work on that aspect of things. So that's pretty much where we're at in terms of a nitrate story. Hand over to John now, who's going to talk about sediment.
Sure, thanks Angus. So the sediment story, I think, is a little more positive than the nutrient nitrate story. And really we started this project thinking about the fact that obviously on a lot of farms, agricultural waterways, there's sediment coming into the system all of the time. But also one of the things that we tend to forget about is there's actually legacies of sediment. So there's been various land use activities going on for 100 years or more in a lot of these catchments. And so they're small waterways. Some of them are spring fed, some of them are manipulated artificially and that sort of thing. But they don't tend to get these enormous flushing flows that we might expect to see in a natural stream or waterway or a braided river. And so what we're seeing is an accumulation of long-term legacies. And there might be a whole bunch of different causes of that. these guys have had the finger pointed at them a lot over the last few years. Often we don't think much maybe about aerial sediment, which has been blown into the system. Obviously in Christchurch, the earthquakes and that sort of thing gave us an example of a lot of wind-blown sediment. And this photo on the right-hand side is just maybe not the best farm practices, with the farmer not providing a good riparian zone and tilling the soil right down to the edge. So there might be a whole bunch of different sources of these sediments. Why do we care? Who cares about the fact that there's a whole lot of silt and sand and that sort of thing in our waterways? Well, if we think about the biota, then we know that that sediment, that excessive fine sediment, can have pretty detrimental effects on the flora and fauna that's living in these waterways. And so on the left-hand side over here, we've got a natural stream, we call a natural stream, a cartoon, especially here in the Canterbury Plains. We have, obviously we're aware of a whole lot of aquifers, water coming out of the ground and that sort of thing. Angus has talked about groundwater. And so in a natural system, we would have lots of cobbles and pebbles, maybe even some larger substrated boulders, and water would be moving both down and up through the system. And lots of small animals, insects and those sort of things would be able to hide in the substrate during flood events. When there's a big predator around the place, they might be able to dive for cover. And so they're used to this environment of having sort of pores and fissures in between the sediment and the bed of our stream. And in fact, we have some animals that actually live down underneath the bed of the stream. So next time you walk along a natural stream system and you're looking at the bed, actually bear in mind that there's actually life underneath the bed as well, and that they can move up and down. So then we add a whole lot of fine sediment, excessive fine sediment, and we end up with the top of the substrate being armoured, and all of a sudden the ability for both water but also aquatic animals to move up and down through the system gets dramatically reduced. And we have a large flood event, or we have predation, and now these invertebrates are totally exposed to being preyed on by various animals. So we've done a bit of work in CAREX on the effect of sediment, on how that changes the health of these waterways. And quite typically when we've got, oops, let's go back a bit, nice, I'll go backward. Yep, thanks. I'll put this down for a second before I do any more damage. So on the left-hand side, we've got sort of cobble, pebble, gravel type stream beds, and often we'll find, assuming there's not other types of contaminants and pollution going on, we'll find a healthier sort of invertebrate community, insects and these sort of animals that are living on the bed of the stream. So we've got, in this example here, some mayflies, some caddisflies and that sort of thing. Then as we move towards a bed of a waterway with a lot more sediment in it, putting aside other contaminants, then we tend to get communities dominated by worms and snails and those sort of things. So a few years ago, one of our PhD students, Frank Burden, did some work on this, where he went out and sampled a whole bunch of streams in agricultural environments around Canterbury, and I think there's about 30 or so waterways there. He basically went and measured the insects, the aquatic invertebrate life, and some of you may be familiar with this EPT, which basically stands for mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies. So these are three of the orders of insects that are often indicators of a healthy waterway, a healthy stream. So mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies, EPT is their scientific names. And so this is the percentage of the whole community that's in this stream bed, which is dominated by mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies. And on the bottom axis here we've got a percent sediment cover. So this is visual cover of the bed. And you can see that when we haven't got a lot of sediment on the bed of our stream, we've got lots and lots of mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies. They dominate the community. But actually as the amount of fine sediment increases, the percentage of EPT is reduced dramatically. So just the presence of fine sediment actually changes the invertebrate community in these systems. Okay, so lots of smoking guns. We played around with fish as well. Fish are unbelievably hard to get good data on. Don't get me started on that. So I'm not even going to try and present some of the fish data for you. But the point is that we can see that just fine sediment alone is having an impact. Okay, what can we do? There's lots of literature out there, especially overseas, using sediment traps, talking about sediment traps. Actually, surprisingly little data in this country on people who have actually gone and installed a sediment trap and then tried to monitor what the effect will be long term. So we went and talked to various people, Waimak District Council, for example, Greg over there, and Greg basically let us go and dig a hole, and well, the farmer did as well, dig a hole in one of his waterways. And so this is Middlebrook up near Rangiora. So we created this sediment trap. Basically, we dug a pond in the middle of the waterway. And this particular one was about 12 metres long, the full width of the waterway, which was a couple of metres here. And we got down to about 0.7 a metre. So we dug a pretty decent size hole here. Typically this is only about 0.2, 0.3 a metre. And so the idea here simply is that we have water flowing, in this case from Rangiora upstream here, so in this direction. And as the water velocity moves into a pond, the water slows down. Okay, we've got a pool there, so velocity decreases and then sediment drops out. And if we know something about the size of the sediment particles, we can work out what sort of water velocity we need to decrease the water to, and therefore how much sediment and what types of sediment is going to drop out. And in fact, this is incredibly successful. This one little sediment trap actually, back of the envelope type estimates, we think was taking about 60 to 70% of the sediment, or stopping about 60% of the sediment from moving downstream, moving to the right here. This is an example of just another little sediment trap we did. So this was about 2 metre wide waterway, got in a scoop and bucket in there, dug it out again to about half a metre or so. The water is flowing from left to right here. So I don't know if you can see this at the back of the room, but on the left-hand side here, there's actually quite a lot of sand and silt, okay, upstream. We put in our sediment trap. You can see it start to fill up with sediment and organic matter and that sort of thing. And look on the right-hand side, this is downstream here. Now we've got exposed cobble, pebble, gravel, and in fact, prior to this happening, this was all covered in sediment as well. So just a very visual example of how these sediment traps can actually capture sediment, take it out of suspension. One of the other little bonuses from the sediment trap was that after constructing this, within 3 or 4 days, we actually started to have fish move into the system. So there was fish in the waterway anyway, but larger fish like pools, they like slower water to rest in, and so our sediment traps actually provided a benefit for that. So we played with a number of other things. This is Angus and myself on a very cold day using a sand wand, which Fish and Game purchased from overseas. So this was like a vacuum cleaner, if you like, and last time we were here I think we may have talked briefly about it. Basically the idea is you push water under pressure onto the stream bed, it stirs up the sediment, you suck out the slurry, take the sediment out, and then put onto paddock and dispose it in some other way. Incredibly intensive, hard work here, but probably works under very certain circumstances. You really want to pick your battles before you try using a sand wand. One of the other things we've been very keen on in this whole CAREX program is this idea of getting people to think about rebattering their streams before they plant. So we talked about legacies, but also there's sediment coming in all the time, and you really only need to walk along a few streams and rivers around Canterbury and you'll see bank collapse occurring, undercutting of banks and those sort of things. So the sediment being added by these events all the time. Whereas if you're able to rebatter, if you're able to actually pull away these collapsing banks, reduce the slope, and then plant, then your opportunity for reducing those point source sediments is greatly reduced, or your opportunity is increased. So we've done quite a bit of rebattering in a number of places, and I can't think of an example. I don't know how many K have we rebatted. I don't know how many, maybe 4 or 5 K kilometres of different stream systems, and then replanted with grass, and then maybe done further riparian planting. In the 4 or 5 years we've been doing this, I haven't seen a single solitary example of any bank collapse occurring of areas where this is, our rebattering has actually made things worse. So, I mean, you only need to go and look at some of these sites to see that they now have full vegetative cover, and that these are no longer sources of point source pollution. So part of it is about trying to reduce the legacies, and things like sediment traps and those sort of things might be useful in that regard. The one issue about a sediment trap is that it needs cleaning regularly, and if you're not doing anything about stopping point sources coming in at a later date, then you're just going to be cleaning out sediment traps for the rest of your life. So if you want a permanent job, maybe that's useful for you. There are other issues here. So we know that a lot of this fine sediment can also have absorbed phosphorus associated with it, and phosphorus is something that's sort of under the radar a little bit. One of the other things that I haven't really shown you data for, but people at ESR have been having a look at our sediment traps, and it looks like they're also able to capture a certain amount of E. coli, so fecal bacteria, human health bacteria. Looks like they may be reduced by these sediment traps. Now, whether the fecal bacteria are falling out of solution, the same as sediment is, or whether they're adhered to the sediment, we're not entirely sure, but that certainly looks like something that's quite promising. So we've got a bunch of handouts which Catherine has mentioned. There's examples up here in the front if you'd like to help yourself at some stage, and these are also available on the websites. So rebattering, good replanting, and starting at the top are the sort of messages that we're trying to sell in these sort of brochures. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about aquatic weeds. So when we started the CAREX program, we talked to a lot of farmers and landowners, council staff, etc., about what some of these major issues were. And one of them, which came out pretty consistently, was the issue of excessive aquatic weeds in these small farm waterways. So a number of councils are doing regular maintenance, having to dig out the waterways to remove weeds. We believe there's some negative effects. We'll talk about those. And this is the work of Katie Collins. So Katie did a PhD on this for a number of years, walking around these waterways and having a look at various aquatic plants. So there's certainly positives and negatives associated with aquatic plants. Angus was talking about organic matter, so these are a form of organic matter in these waterways. They are habitat for some small invertebrates and fish. They're in there growing, and especially over the summer, they're respiring, they're also producing oxygen, so they're doing a service as far as oxygen levels in the waterways are concerned. Maybe if you've got excessive macrophytes, they might actually be reducing oxygen levels. And there's been a lot of suggestion that you should be planting weeds because they'll soak up all the nutrients. And actually some of the work we've been doing on this indicates that that story isn't quite as clear as people might think. So there's also issues with them. In a number of the waterways we've been looking around in Canterbury, they're sort of dominated by monkey musk and watercress. Seem to be two of the plants that we're seeing a lot of. This is monkey musk on the yellow flower here. So it reduces flow when you in the middle of summer, you've got 100% cover in your waterway. It reduces the velocity of the water quite dramatically and holds the water up, and so that's where it becomes a potential drainage issue. Also, because the water velocity is reduced, we're getting fine sediment dropping down onto the bed of the stream, so we're back into the potential excessive fine sediment side of things. And from a farm management point of view, we've got significant reduction in drainage occurring. And so a whole bunch of techniques are being used by councils and drainage committees to deal with this excessive fine sediment. Often we see the digger in there, getting in there, trying to rake out all these aquatic weeds, aquatic plants. Might do that a couple of times a year. Historically, we've seen probably some less than perfect practices going on there, where the whole bed has actually been dug out and dumped on the bank, and so we end up with some very, very steep banks. There's the potential for a lot of fauna to be greatly disturbed. If we're getting, really aggressive maintenance occurring, we get eels on the bank and those sort of things. And of course, a lot of these plants are actually, well, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but a lot of these plants are growing from fine fragments as well. So you break up monkey musk and watercress, and you might remove those out of the drain or the waterway at that time, but what you're doing is creating an opportunity for more of these to grow later on. So we've done, Katie in particular did a bunch of experiments. She did some really small scale ones, some really small trials, just to have a look at a couple of different techniques, and then we scaled up to a couple of larger examples. So the small scale trials initially were just over a couple of metre reaches. This was a 240 metre reach where we had 8 different treatments going on and 7 replicates. So we had 7 times each of the 8 treatments. Shade cloth was used, this one over here, which was only partial shading. That failed completely. We actually grew a lot of macrophytes. They loved partial shading, so that wasn't quite what we were trying to do. We tried spraying, hand weeding. This is actually using weed mat to cover not only the bank but also into the stream, and in fact that was extremely effective at actually reducing this monkey musk and watercress. So what happens here is that monkey musk and watercress are growing, at least initially, from the banks, so their roots are actually along the banks here, and so if you can smother them out of the banks, then you can reduce the growth in the waterway. Once they become really established and they've been there for a long time, then the roots start to develop in the bed of the stream. So it depends on when you can hit them. Shading, so we tried some full shading trials, and not surprisingly these were extremely effective. So this was only 5 metre canopy here, and we replicated this. In fact, we didn't do this ideally. We actually started this experiment when there was actually full cover across the stream. So this is a different stream in Hinds, about 3 metres wide, and we added the shade cloth, and after about 2 months it had actually killed off all the watercress and monkey musk underneath it. So this shade cloth is extremely effective at dealing with these particular 2 types of weeds anyway. Katie also did a series of experiments, which I'm not going to show you here, where she tried different levels of shading, and not surprisingly different plant species react differently. So some of the watercress and monkey musk very susceptible to shading, whereas some of the submerged macrophytes were not, and so they actually were able to tolerate reasonable levels of shading. So then we tried scaling this up a bit more, and so this was done at more 50 metre reaches now. We had control reaches, we had hand weeding where we got in there and pulled them out by hand, because that's one of the techniques that's used by a number of councils in very specific areas to try and hand weed. Then we tried something a bit crazy, and that was actually putting polythene sheet over the stream, over the waterway, and did this at 50 metre reaches. I was like, there's no way these are going to survive. The next flood's going to blast them out, and the farmer will be on the phone screaming at us and that sort of thing. These things stayed up for about 1.5 years, and there were multiple floods, and they stayed there the whole time. So weed mat. So we tried combinations of weed mat along the waterway as well. And actually, so I haven't actually got data on this, but the hand weeding was very successful for about a month, and then the weeds came back and in spades. And in fact, we did this at a couple of sites, including a 400 metre reach, and after about 2 months the site was worse than when we had started. We had encouraged weed growth. The polythene sheeting actually worked fantastically well, so it actually killed off submerged macrophytes as well. And when we came to the end of the experiment, the farmer didn't really want us to pull it down, but we thought we can't leave it here. Eventually they're going to blow out. And the weed mat also is extremely effective. So we then tried something in a 400 metre reach. This is again up by Rangiora, and this is the site upstream. This is about 3 metres wide or so, and 100% cover of macrophytes. What we did was put polythene along both sides of this waterway for 400 metres and completely reduce this macrophyte growth. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo, but I can get one for you if you're interested. And now this would be 3 years later, 4 years later, 3 years later, Greg? Greg hasn't had to do any maintenance in the stretch downstream as far as I'm aware.
Starting last couple of years.
Starting to, okay, starting to need some maintenance. But very effective as a short-term measure for controlling macrophytes, in particular this monkey musk watercress side of things. So one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is riparian planting, and this is CAREX sector, and this site was planted about 4 years ago. Believe it or not, there actually is a waterway here, right through here. So we rebatted this site, planted, and this is about 3 years later. The landowner here, I was talking to him a couple of months ago, and he said he has had to do nothing on this drain for the last 4 years. Now, actually, I think he did do a little bit about 2 years ago. I think he had to take out a little bit of macrophytes. But basically, as far as he's concerned, this has turned from a 900 metre reach, where he was having to do maintenance every year to remove macrophytes, to 900 metre reach, virtually no maintenance. So, we've been talking about riparian planting, rebattering, choosing the right plants. We've found that CAREX seems to be a really good plan. To be honest, we don't know what it's going to be like in 10 years' time. It's a source of organic matter, it's a source of shading. People have said to us, oh, you can't plant CAREX, the next time my stream floods, it's going to rip all that out. No, not from our experience. We've done this in 4 or 5 sites. We've had some significant high flows. We haven't seen CAREX ripped out. We've rebatted first, so we've taken away a lot of the overhanging banks. Weed mat along the side of the waterway and actually into the waterway, I think can be extremely effective. Short term, it's not a long term solution. It's a short term solution while you're planting and your plants are trying to get away. And combining this with tools is a really important message.
Okay, so we've shared a lot of data and stories about things that we've trialed and things that have worked. What I did also wanted to say, which we had, which Katie found, is the cost of maintaining the weeds sort of evened out. So when you combine, the planting and the maintenance of those plants, and you compare that to the annual rates of mechanical clearance over 10 years, they pretty much were comparable. I think the most expensive thing was the hand weeding. So I think that was another lesson learned, but it'd be great to sort of test that in the different communities about whether or not those numbers are true, but that's sort of just an additional thought around that, or a common question that comes up. So I wanted to wrap up by just giving you this slideshow to talk about the fact that we were able to trial these tools simply because partnership was a huge feature of this experiment, and that's something that working with all of you and the communities we understand as being really significant. The fact that we trialed these on places that were farms and across the region, a lot of farmers and decision makers were able to learn just by seeing what we did and in different combinations and by working in partnership. So this is just one of these case studies. This was a typical waterway. This is the waterway where Katie did her research, and this is what it looked like when we came upon it in 2013. And through partnerships like Living Water, Te Ara Kakariki, and Whakahora Te Wahora, we were able to get plants and earthworks and those sorts of things covered while we did the scientific monitoring. So we went to this waterway that looks typical to most of these waterways across the region. We pulled back the hedge to see that the waterway banks had really truly collapsed on one side and fallen in and were highly piled up on one side from where the clearance was. The community came out and sort of allowed us to advise them on the planting of the CAREX right on the water's edge, the rebattering as well, and the removal of those piles. That's how much sediment had piled up on that one side. And that also allowed us to do these small scale trials that Jon had just talked about at these across 200 or so meters. the plants themselves have grown up, and so the idea was that we planted on the north side to try and boost shading over the waterway and used a range of different plant types. So again, strategically thinking about these buffers as just plants, but thinking about which plants could give us organic matter into the waterway, so which ones could grow really tall, so thinking about the traits of these plants. And so, you know, we had a number of different strategies going on where we had CAREX planting for the weeds, but also a range of plants to allow birds to come and bees to pollinate and shade to be provided and that sort of thing. And so this is the waterway just last month. But this story, this 1 kilometer within, or 9 kilometers, is just one story of 9 across the larger region. And so this is a photo that Living Water took of the waterway that actually feeds into this wetland, that is downstream of a wetland, the Silver Stream wetland. And so it's part of a larger story that we're contributing to. And also because we were able to do these trials specifically on weeds and planting, we were also able to facilitate a way of working together with people like those at ESR to look at sediment traps and the benefits of these tools for things like E. coli, fecal coliform. The same site was then also used to grow other things within the catchment. So the Snake Creek project, for example, we were really happy to see that funded and contribute in the knowledge that we've learned. Also, we know that this also maps to the Swimmable Selwyn project, so there's some of our sites there that contribute to that data. And so, yeah, so all of that has been happening in different communities across the region. So, yeah, so it's just really acknowledging the fact that we couldn't have done this research without a lot of that partnership. So the one thing that we also hear about is, you know, riparian management for us has just been the first step, and that's allowed us to do the testing of tools. And so we absolutely think that that needs to continue, and there's a lot of questions about how to do that and what this CAREX approach is, and so we have those tip sheets around that. But we also wanted to recognize that there's still a lot of research to do around biological restoration, and so this is just acknowledging that Environment Canterbury is a partner in a project that's really thinking about the food web. So we didn't really talk about biodiversity in stream because it actually turns out it's quite complicated. We have waterways that are pretty resilient, but in an unhealthy way. And so this is another story. So CAREX ends this year, but this is another story that the researchers at the University of Canterbury will continue to pursue. What is this theory around why are these biological communities taking so long to restore? What's the resistance and resilience of those kinds of things? And so just watch this space, and we look forward to working with ECAN on moving this forward. And so finally, so a lot of this information, we thought, you know, ECAN was, you know, the primary resource user for us. And that's one of the reasons why we thought about producing these tip sheets that you can download and you can cite publicly, and they're available. And so we're really looking forward to having this, you know, this part of the journey captured in all of the different decision-making things that you need to do. And so you could go to the Get CAREX tips for all of these newsletters and these tip sheets pretty much by going to that website, and then for further information about the CAREX approach on the CAREX website. So I just wanted to end with a couple of examples. So things that have turns out that are really interesting is that the outreach component of our work I know aligns really well with teams here at ECAN. Just by bringing people to these sites and bringing them on the journey has been really effective. So in 1 year alone, we did, you know, almost 1,000 people coming through these different sites to look and see at the story as it was unraveling. And this included outreach events with local schools, with Tamariki, with Rangatahi coming to the sites and sampling themselves. And then also had a lot to do with farmers coming and talking to other farmers, and that was equally effective. And so we really just want to acknowledge that, because that's, I think, one of the reasons why people have been really interested in CAREX so far. So from ECAN alone, like, these are our most popular posts in the last month. Things like identifying sites. There's been a really, like, these two posts alone have gotten thousands of reshares and likes and things for whatever reason, but that just tells us that there's a big need for some of this information. The one on the right got like 8,000 posts over a weekend. People are interested in understanding what's the story with sediment, and so that's hopefully things that you can take on into your job. And hopefully we've been able to contribute a little bit more in terms of understanding the relationships between all of these different issues in waterways. The CAREX Key Steps, that has its own tip sheet. And again, this was all co-developed with many of you in the room. This is the toolbox that we ended up doing. So we really thought about issues and the potential options, and the research that we have in terms of the papers are still coming out. And so we just invite you to keep following for those, the stories to supplement. these lessons. So with that, we wanted to just thank everyone. This truly is a partnership, and so a lot of the science was funded by Mackenzie Charitable Trust, but a lot of the other bits around the earthworks and our ability to do the trials were because we helped farmers get individual grants on their properties to do the work, and so we wanted to acknowledge all of those people as well. And with that, I think we have some time for questions. Okay, kia ora. So do we have, we have some, all right.
Well, firstly, thank you, Petra. That was really interesting talk, and to everyone else that's tested as well. Wanted to hear any thoughts or observations in the course of the research on the effectiveness of the waterways in relation to seed dispersal for any of the native species, or any implications that might have for the restoration of rock area habitats.
Seed dispersal. Excuse me. So there's a couple, I guess, layers to that. I mean, there's the aquatic weeds part of the story, which John alluded to, the fact that these the nuisance ones grow from fragments, and so we're kind of distributing the parts that allow it to become so much more prolific. And it's this story of probably a solution that was a small management solution to deal with the weeds actually ended up kind of creating more of a seed bank, and that's why it's a bigger problem today. But for riparian planting, we have about 3 or 4 years of some of these plants already, and in those sites where we have quite a bit of planting, we're starting to see them already go to seed, and some naturally, if you go to the Silverstream wetland in particular, you start to see a lot of these plants are already self-seeding and growing, and so I guess it just depends on, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it really is kind of having a maintenance plan to stay on top of that. And
I guess the point of the question is it fair to say that if you get a really well-established area and they're self-seeding, like you say, will the water actually carry those seeds downstream, or will it actually start to regenerate naturally?
Yeah, we don't have data to...
No, we can't really answer that. We don't have data on seed dispersal by the stream. We certainly have seen, one of our Ashburton farmers has had long-term riparian planting, and he's getting a lot of natural regrowth occurring in dispersal, but
I think the extent of the problem suggests that kind of outcome might be quite a few decades away. Yeah, I think we've got awful lot of work to do the planning ourselves before we can get to a point where there's more sort of a self-sustaining system like that.
Yep, Emily.
With the planting, have you noticed much difference with the CAREX effectiveness, the position, east-west of the waterways, that sort of thing?
Well, I think that's tricky because I think Katie had one of her waterways was kind of on an angle, and so the partial that sort of meant that she had some partial shade things. We wonder if that's why in some it's taken a longer while to get the full coverage over the waterway and that sort of thing. But that's kind of an isolate. That's one waterway versus another one.
Well, yeah. 3 or 4 of them have now got almost total coverage. So in a way, the direction of the water body has sort of become irrelevant from the shading and that sort of thing that CAREX is providing. It's remarkable the difference we've seen in the growth of some of these CAREX depending on local climatic conditions. One farmer did 9k, and he had one end of it was near the ocean and the CAREX were going very, very slowly. Another farm literally less than a kilometre away had the CAREX just absolutely took off, and so that was just differences in microclimate.
I think there are a few more questions on this side. Sophie?
I'm just wondering, so you referred to macrophytes, how they're good at trapping sediment. Has anyone ever chosen a sacrificial area where you might not get too much flooding and let those macrophytes accumulate sediment, like an equivalent of a sediment trap, just because often for sediment trap installation you need a resource consent, so maybe that could be another form of sediment funds.
You still have to, the problem is macrophytes grow up in the winter and it just gets released then. And so I think, and there's the downsides of them. It seems like the equation's pretty heavily weighed in favour of getting rid of them, because they're, most of almost all the ecosystem services would suggest that it would be better to get rid of them than retain them. Certainly our work suggests that when they're not doing anything to aid nutrient retention, and there might be some nutrient short-term sediment trapping there, but because the seasonal growth would suggest that that would get sort of exported pretty quickly. We've probably got the data to test that, because we've got some reaches where we haven't taken away the macrophytes that we could look at that. It's a good thing to look at. I think we can probably prove that that's the case.
Well, we know some farmers, I mean, we work with at other sites, and I think about the L2, and there's some farmers there that have chosen not to, manage their waterways. And I mean, we see like the sediment is still accumulating, and there needs to be a solution for that, because all you need is a high flow event to then, so if there are these, I think the key that with keeping sediment in a localized place, there needs to be a management plan, or some sort of regular maintenance, because that sediment all you need is a one in a 1 year event to take that and transport it off, and that might be, and so it is really thinking about the sources and the legacies and having a plan for that. That's probably more critical than saying, the solution is a dedicated area. You need some steps around its active maintenance. Yeah. So there's a question in the back.
Thanks, Jon. Really excited about your good news on the inputs of carbon from leaves and plants, and how that could be 2 or 3 times more nitrogen removal in the waterway. And so naturally I'm going on that thinking, what kind of plants? Sort of go into that area. I mean, I'm thinking, you introduce willows and introduce plants in the city with the best, they drop the most, and native trees drop the less, and your CAREX probably drops the least of all. Sort of the opposite.
Well,
yeah, so it's a trade-off between how labile the carbon is, how quickly it breaks down, and willows are likely to crack. Sorry, because they break down really quickly. I mean, so it's likely to be a short-term effect. So hence, wood chips are probably likely to be, if we can retain them in the waterway, are likely to be good, because there's a long-term carbon source there, lots of surface area and those sorts of things. So actually, it's likely to be, particularly because willows are pretty bad in some other respects, water loss and those sorts of things. We've got some pretty important data on Canterbury mudfish which suggests that they're quite detrimental in that respect. I think there's a bit of work to be done on that, but we're likely to be going with native, well, not necessarily native, but a carbon source which is likely to stick around, be retained, and be constantly put in. It's very unlikely that it's going to be willows, because...
Sure, I'm just giving you the red flag, but what about your native trees?
But I think that's a thing. I think we want a diversity, because there's different roles that carbon offers. So you want some slowly decomposing carbon so that you can have denitrification happening, but you also want leaves from different types, like pittosporum and even exotics, because that's the type of leaf that the invertebrates and the microbes need. And so I think some of the data that we have support you want a diversity. So we're not saying CAREX sector everywhere. You actually, if denitrification is an issue, which it is, and freshwater food webs are issues, which they are, you need to have, it's really, this is why we say rethink the riparian zone, because it's not just planting them and assuming that, biodiversity and all these other functions will be addressed. It's actually thinking about them offering more than one benefit, and so, I don't know.
I think that's really important. We did actually do some various decomposition experiments with a whole range of different species, and willows in summer can break down in 2 weeks. Flax, you can die of old age waiting for them.
Yeah.
So it is, I think, diversity, and one of the other things that's come out of this actual discussion with various planting groups is actually increasing that range of species that you use. Often people might use 20 or 30 species. Well, actually, there's some suggestion that maybe we should be thinking in riparian planting of 50, 60 different species.
And I mean, it really, and then, I mean, we've had conversations even with, ecologists here at ECAN thinking about there's no reason why you can't have a full different canopy, so it's really, there's just no data on that, and we really need to understand what are we wanting to get out of the riparian buffer and have that work for the farmer. And I think a lot of farmers that we talk to agree, like it's thinking about it, it's not land you give up, but it's land that you're giving to carry out these services that you care about.
But the CAREX grass won't in itself provide a lot of nitrogen, is that?
No, it's not a nitrogen source or anything that we know of.
It's not a nitrogen source. Sorry, just
lots of carbon, sorry.
It's a carbon source.
Yeah. So actually rank grass can actually be a good source of carbon as well. Just one other point which we haven't really talked about is a lot of the stuff we've been doing here has been based around Hines and Te Waihoa, etc. And one of the big decisions there is that you can't plant something that is pivot irrigated. So that actually, well, it doesn't limit your options, but that certainly changes your decision-making process.
Sorry, just repeat that point. Yes,
Sorry, that a lot of the farmers have been removing shelter belts because of their pivot irrigators. So really you need to be, if that's an issue in the landscape you're dealing with, then you need to be thinking about plants that aren't going to grow more than about 3 metres in height.
2 metres we can't.
Yeah.
Some people have higher irrigators, but yeah, 2 to 3 metres.
So that, yeah. There's a follow-up question, sort of, yeah?
In those sections that you covered, I don't know how long they were, but was there any noticeable decrease in water temperature? And if so, how much
the shaded ones.
would that be to suppressing?
You know, I don't think we measured water temperature, but in some of the reaches we've been showing you there, one was 900 metres, another was 800 metres. So the work that NIWA's done has indicated that over about 200 to 300 metres you can get a drop of 1 degree or so if you've got, you know, very high shading. So I don't think we have that data, but I would be very surprised if we haven't been able to reduce the summer high water temperatures in some of those systems. But yeah, I don't think we put in.
Actually, Katie probably has it in her light loggers. So I know we've looked at it because it would come with the tidbits.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think just, I believe we're supposed to see if there's any other questions online. Is that right, Corinne? No,
all right.
we're good. Okay. All right, well, I think that's good. So I think some of us have another meeting at 2, but anyway, just thank you very much. Surely, like, it's clear that we tried to answer questions and ended up raising more. So we'll be here for a little bit longer for questions, but thank you very much for coming.